Right. Well, I was thinking more about cars and classic cars. And I thought, well, if I relate more to myself, because let's face it, I'm just average. Obviously, I think I'm average. And I think I have an average view for, a male of my age, probably, with cars. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit first of my experiences with cars, and I think they're probably not a lot different to many fellows of my age. And therefore, that has a bearing not only on where we are today with cars, classic cars as we're going to call them, but what the future might hold. So, cars to me are a large part of my way of life, and they're sort of how I see myself or have seen myself in society. That might sound strange, but cars play a major impact. They played a major impact, rather, to me as a child. I formulated, sort of much of my childish games and fantasies, when I was a little boy around cars. I collected toy cars and I played games with them. I created little roads and streets and everything, either in the house. I remember I used to make streets made out of dominoes, or drew them on the floor with a pen or pencil, and then I would make believe that situations where cars were parking or driving from one place to another, for example. And then as a teenager, I started to dream of owning a car. I fell in love with some of them in my mind, but I didn't really understand the technicalities of cars at that time. I didn't really understand a lot about engines and even how they work, to be honest with you, and I certainly didn't understand the differences in performance and the expectation of performances between cars at that stage of my life. So the attraction with the cars was focused on the design and the image that the car offered, and that was important because I think the public image of these cars was created by the marketing and advertising industry. And as a teenager, I fell for that. So certain cars created certain images in your mind because that's what you were told. And the image that you probably had for your aspiration of how you saw yourself in society, whether you saw yourself as a tearaway young person driving fast cars, or as I did, a person who really wanted a home and a solid home with a good job, and I saw myself with a sort of family car, even though I was a teenager. That's kind of really where my aspirations lied. So, I remember walking around the streets. For example, when I lived but I didn't know much at that time when I was a young teenager. And when I was a young teenager, I was walking around the streets. I lived in Ottawa, in Canada at the time. And, me and a couple of guys, we were mad about cars. And I remember walking around the streets, and we used to peer into the driver's window, and look at the speedometers and see how fast the car could go, because if the speedometer, went up to 120 miles an hour, we thought, well, that's how fast the car went. And we were really impressed, and we would be saying, oh, look, this car does 120 miles an hour. But that's really what our impressions of cars were, and how much we really knew about things. So, and also, in those days, they had regular TV adverts, especially at the end of a year, of a season of the cars, when the new seasons were starting, the new range was coming. So there'd be lots of TV adverts. And I remember in 1959, for example, in Canada, it was a real pivotal year then, because I think the design of the American car coming out of Detroit then was really focused on fins and differences between the models and the curves and the shapes, and that was what was selling the car. And if you take General Motors, they were doing a really good thing. They had a basic car, a basic chassis, basic car actually, and they changed the front end and the back end a bit. But the interior, apart from the dash would be a little different and maybe the materials, but the actual cars were the same. So the Pontiacs and the Chevys and the Oldsmobiles, they were all the same car, but of course they varied according to their desirability in a sort of a system of expensive to not so expensive to really expensive, whatever. And of course, if you were basic models, you were buying with the Chevy, and they went all the way up to the Cadillac. And if you look at the roof lines, for example, the various roof lines of those cars in '59, there were a couple of different styles that they used, but they were the same in the Cadillac and they were the same in the Chevy. But so it would be difficult in some respects if you just saw the actual top roof line to distinguish between a Cadillac and a Chevy. But of course, when you saw the rest of the car, the differences, of course, were in trim and everything else. But it was an image game. So I think everything was at a peak, and I was falling in love with these cars, and I was really becoming attuned to the designs and what the designs meant, and what the designs meant in terms of the range of the car. This was a big marketing exercise, and I was really involved in it. I'm not saying that everyone felt that way, because perhaps I was more design orientated. I was at art school, and I was really into art at the time. So design was something that was filling up my head. I was really interested in it. But eventually I came to England, and when I left school, and I was actually able to sort of think about buying a car, and I was living in England, of course now I was looking at cars in a totally different way. The primary driver was, of course, what, as it were, is what I could afford, and also a car that was practical for what I needed at the time, which was basically to get to work and to go shopping and do things like that, the usual things, because I was married and was working and living a fairly normal, what I thought was a normal life. But up until that point, I'd spent a period where I'd been a passenger in lots of cars, though I didn't own one, and I'd been around lots of cars, and my friend had a Morris Minor convertible, and we drove around in that a lot, and a lot of guys that I knew had old, especially in the late 50s, early 60s, had pre-war, the old English black sort of cars, Morrises and Austins, which were fairly cheap then, and in fact they disappeared fairly quickly in that period, because the MOT, the testing, was brought in, the government testing, and the first thing it did was basically cleared a lot of old cars off the road that couldn't meet the test requirements. But I'd been around a lot of those cars, so they'd been sort of. Then there were cars that actually, at that period, that I really, really lusted after. This is before I had a car of my own. There were the Minis, of course, had come out, and they were very desirable. But I was never really attracted at the time to the Mini. I appreciated them, and I thought they were great. But I liked the Riley 1.5s, the Wolseley 1500s, cars like that, which were so a bit more luxurious, more of a mini saloon car, which is the only ones I've been into. Then, of course, I did start going into some more luxurious cars. In fact, there was one of my bosses at the time. He had a Humber Scepter, which I thought was just like a Rolls Royce, and he used to pick me up a lot of mornings and drive me into work, because he went past my house. That's before I had a car, and I was so impressed with that car. But cars were a real barometer of social success, and social positioning of many people. The car that sat on your driveway, or that you drove to work, it said a lot about you, and it said a lot about how you were getting on in life and how successful you were. And I'm not saying this is something new, but it was very big at that time. We were coming into that period now of very, very... I mean, we'd been through periods, I think, in society beforehand where you were either rich or you were poor, you were either privileged or not privileged, whatever. But now we were getting into a period where most people were able to access goods, products, items. They were to buy things, like they were able to afford a car. But the difference was, what car? The person that owned a banger, a real old rundown car, or the person at the other end who was able to afford a brand new car. And in between there were all the different variations. And especially if you worked for a company, you maybe all the people that worked for the company in the middle management had the same car, but there were different trim levels. Say the Cortina, as a good example. In America, it might have been the Chevy or whatever. And of course, as you climbed the corporate ladder, as it were, you were given, if you had a car, from a company car, of course, you were given a better version. Had more letters after it, GL or GT or GXL or whatever. And that said a lot about you when you went into the car park at work. But anyway, then there came the time when it was the moment really that I'd realized or decided that I could afford to buy my first car. And the car that I really loved, though I wasn't a big Mini fan, the car that I really loved, for whatever reason, and who can explain attractions like this, but was a Mini Traveller, the little Mini with the wood at the back and the two little doors that opened up. I just loved that car. I just loved the look of it and the practicality of it. And I just, I envisaged and fantasized with a sort of lifestyle that I could have, where I had this little estate car, as it were, a station wagon, whatever you want to call it. Two little doors, wood on the side. Oh, this was wonderful. Anyway, I saw one in an advert in a local paper. And one night, I remember I got on the bus with a friend of mine to go over to this address where the car was. It belonged to some guy who was selling it. And it was pouring rain. I remember really bad rain. I mean, we got off the bus and we started walking down this street, houses. And outside, I suddenly, as I turned a corner, I remember it was dusk as well. It was just starting to get dark, and it had been raining. I think the rain had stopped, but it was raining. And I saw this beautiful white Mini Traveller parked outside this house. And when a car's been cleaned and waxed and it's really clean, and then it rains and you've got beads of water all over it, and the light is dimming a bit, any car looks good. Well, this car looked stunning, and sort of actually, the moment I saw it, I was still walking towards it. I'd already bought it. It was in my mind. That's it. I'm buying it. This is not going to... I'm not going to leave without this car. So I walked around, had a look at it, met the guy, talked about it a bit, and, running my hand along the roof line, and the water was beating off and running down across the windows, and the chrome, or the plastic that looked like chrome, and beading everywhere. It looked absolutely stunning. And then suddenly, I felt this pressure on my shoulder. A hand was squeezing my shoulder, and it was my friend. He was pulling me sort of backwards slightly towards him, and he leaned into me. And I remember that there was rain dripping off his head, off his hair, I guess, into my neck. And he whispered in my ear, well, he kind of screamed that, hang on, look at this, there's rust in, I remember he said there were rust in the wheel arches, and the wood was rotten, because while I was talking to this owner, and I was in love with this car, And just really, I didn't see it. I had rose-coloured glasses on, I guess. My friend had been around the car himself, so he's now whispering to me that I was to leave it, walk away, go. So this was very difficult for me. I was at a crossroads in my life, I guess, there. I'd fallen in love with this Mini, and then I took his advice, and we got on a bus and went home. But during the journey home, I'm afraid I kept looking sideways to him, and I was very angry with him, really. But of course, as it turned out, I guess he was right. I'll never know, but I guess he was right. 1, 2, 3. Well, anyway, I wasn't happy for quite a while, I don't think, but eventually I saw another advert. It was actually in, I can't quite remember, but anyway, the car that I then fell in love with, well, I think I was going to be in love with it. There was a bit of infatuation at that stage, I guess, was a Hillman Imp, and it was in a small car dealer. There used to be a lot of these in those days, and this car dealer was just off the seafront in Brighton, in a little street, and he had a small sort of showroom, as it were, quite narrow, and about 4 or 5 cars squeezed into it, which he drove in off the road, across the pavement, the sidewalk. Anyway, I remember going in there and sort of squeezing past, the few cars that were in the front that were really nice. I don't remember what they were, but they were nice and shiny, I suppose, and more than I could afford. And then at the back there was this little turquoise-coloured Hillman Imp. Well, it was love at first sight. I mean, God, what a lovely car this was. And it was a nice car because it was not like all the old black pre-war cars that my friends had, and it wasn't as basic and small and sort of odd as the Mini, because this car had wind-up windows, and it was bigger, and it was like a 3-box shape, because it had a sort of boot in the front. I say boot in the front because the engine was in the back, and then it had a bit sticking out the back, so it looked like a big car, and it had the opening back window. I thought, that's great. I was now envisaging again that I could put shopping in the back and things in the back, and the back seat folded down, and it was wonderful. Anyway, so it was love at first sight then, really. So I bought it, but I really found out. Well, it was delivered. I think it was a couple of days. I think I remember it was delivered to outside the apartment where I lived, and I remember going out and seeing it. Oh, it was just wonderful. But I'll tell you, it wasn't long. It was only a couple of days before I started to get a lesson in owning cars or buying cars. But it was my first car, and I loved it without reservations. Very soon I discovered that there was a lot of filler in it, which cracked, and every time I'd been out for a drive, I came back and found that paint was flaking off, and there was filler cracking under the paint, and there was rust. As you looked at it, the rust seemed to spread, and it never ran well. It was always seemed to sound, though I didn't know what the problem was, it sounded rough. It didn't seem to sound well. And then finally, I remember, it wasn't long, maybe 3 or 4 months after that, I was coming back from South London, and coming up to a long hill, going into Brighton, coming into Brighton, and apparently, well, I didn't know it at the time, but apparently what oil was left in the transaxle, like the gearbox, and which is part of the engine, or the transmission rather, differential, at the back. This oil, it sort of, because I was going up the hill, it ran to the back, and the gears were all churning around without any lubrication. So eventually there wasn't an explosion, but basically they must have seized up from the heat. Anyway, the gearbox seized. The car came to a halt, slowed right down, and then it wouldn't move. Eventually, actually, when I sat there for maybe an hour, keep trying it, eventually the car did drive away again. I'm guessing now that it seized up from overheating this gearbox, and then eventually when it cooled down, it started up. Anyway, I took it into the garage where I bought it, the dealer, and he wouldn't have anything to do with it. He said that nothing to do with him, and so on. So that's another lesson that I kind of learned then. But it did spoil my relationship with the car, and it wasn't too long that I saw another car for sale that I liked, and I decided to try and trade it in for this new car. And what was a new car? Well, the new car was another Imp, but this time it was a much newer one, and it was one of the more improved versions. So this was a Singer Chamois, or Singer Chamois. It was an Imp which had got a better image, better name. It had better trim. It had imitation wood on the inside, though it might even have been real wood at that time, on the dash and on the doors. It had really nice leather, black leather inside, and carpet was of better quality, and even had a white stripe. It was green with a white stripe running down the side, and that was surrounded, I think I remember, by little chrome strips. So it was a luxurious car in its looks. So I actually bought it, but that car turned out to be really good, and I travelled around all over the south of England in that car for a number of years. Had no trouble with it, really. Went all the way to on holiday with me to the West Country, down to Cornwall, all over the place. And I did everything, took it to work every day. I impressed all my friends with it. I remember impressing the people I worked with, because it was a smart little car. I mean, in the standing that I was, in terms of my employment and my income and everything, my position in sort of society, that car was top of the tree. And where people had, that I knew, and my friends, and they had sort of damaged cars, or cars that we would call bangers, really, or ordinary Imps or Minis, this was a much better upmarket version, and I loved it to bits. And I then had this new feeling of understanding, really, or what this could do for your own prestige and your own mind, and the impression that you gave, or you felt you gave, to other people in what you drove around. When you drove into a car park, maybe at the supermarket, and you got out and you saw somebody looking at you and looking at your car, this was something that was very powerful for a young person like me, and I think many like me. Now, whether this feeling today relates to cars, I don't know, because it can relate to clothes, it can relate to your personal appearance, how you relate to other people, and how you see people perceiving you, and how you want people to perceive you, and what sort of image or feeling you have. This is nothing new, but for me, and many like me, as I say, I think at that time it was put into reality by the cars that we drove. Anyway, then I think one of the big drivers in my life that helped push me on to become more successful was the drive, or the possibility of changing my car and moving upmarket vehicle-wise. So I will bring the story of and the history of my car purchases and ownerships to an end for a while, or at least on this video. I just wanted to add all of that to give some idea of how cars played such a big part in my life. And from that point onwards, when I had my little singer imp, I moved from one car to another, each time taking a step up the ladder. And the step up the ladder in my cars was equal to and a reflection of my step up the ladder in life and position in my employment, etc. And as I saw myself within society. But it also was of a major interest in my life, because importantly, in those days, what was importantly is what we didn't have. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have social media. We didn't have the immediate access to information and the availability to be in contact directly in real time with as many people around the world as we desired. What we could do then was to go to the library and get books, to research or research a subject that we were interested in. We could go to the library and read reference books to educate ourselves on a particular subject. We had television with one or two channels, and maybe once a week or twice a week there was historical documents or documentaries or programs that were of interest in terms of how to build an object, how to do some carpentry or how to do some gardening or whatever. And we might wait all week to watch a half hour or an hour program that would explain to us how to grow potatoes or something, or how to clean our or service our car perhaps. But that only happened maybe once or twice a week if we were lucky. Then of course we could go to the pub and talk to people, try to find somebody who had a common interest, say cars, or we would talk to people at work, and maybe there was a colleague at work who was also interested in cars. And so it was not a wide playing field by any means. And you tended to focus on one or two things of interest, because even if you felt you wanted to find something different to talk about, or you had other things in your mind that you were interested in, it was not always that easy to get involved in other subjects. Certainly not the way it is now. So today, anybody can think to themselves, they get up in the morning, I think, I'd like to know about heavy tractors, or whales, or I don't know, any subject you can think about. And they can turn their computer on, or their phone. They can just turn their phone on and type in a few words, and they can then spend the rest of the day watching videos, reading articles, and so on a particular subject. And the moment they become slightly bored or another thought comes into their mind, they can shift onto another subject. This, I believe, has a bearing on society and the generation that has been born into this situation where there is instant gratification, instant information, instant entertainment. And we didn't have it when I was a child. Now, ultimately, I believe this will have an effect on what will happen with any subject. For example, how many young people today really, and I don't know the answer, but I can use my common sense here, how many young people today really spend hours and hours when they come home from school or whatever, spending all their spare time sitting in front of a chess set, playing chess, or pick up a newspaper and reading about a particular chess game and following the moves of one particular chess game where two masters were playing against each other. I don't believe that they would be. I did. I used to spend a couple of hours in the evening trying to understand with my chess set, following the moves of some match, or trying to solve a problem which was posed in a little article in the newspaper asking you what would be the next move in this situation. And therefore my interest in cars as well was intense. And so intense that as I got older and other things came into my life, I still had a great desire to become involved in classic cars, think about them, spend money on them, and so on. I don't believe that's going to be the case. And then with the next generation. And then when you add to that the other factors of these cars not going to be produced, that governments probably will be proactive in legislation to curtail the use of them. This could be in many ways, whether it's to do with the availability of the fuel, whether it's to do with the availability of spares, whether it's availability of your ability to drive them on certain roads or at certain times of the day or in certain places, whatever. Who knows? That means that there's a question as to what will happen to the thousands and tens of thousands of old cars that are on the road and owned by a large amount of the population. Now, I think what will happen is that as people die who look at these cars as being classic cars, there will be less of those people around, so that means that more of these cars will just be considered as old cars, and we will probably go back to the stage where certain cars stand out head and shoulder above others. Now, these may be old Rolls-Royces, old Aston Martins, some supercars, some cars that have an association with a celebrity, and so on. But the numbers of these cars will become small. The average car, my Mercedes, that's 30 years old at the moment, a lot of BMWs, a lot of Minis, a lot of cars that are on the road at the moment, which are being used, traded, sold, marketed as classics, will simply become old cars. And there'll be old cars which are becoming difficult to keep on the road, because maybe some of them will not be allowed to be driven into cities, some of them will be stopped from going onto motorways, maybe you can't get spares for others, and so on. Then there's a practicality as well, which I find, that the simple maintenance of just keeping these cars running will be affected, and that is when you can't find somebody to tune the carburetor or to deal with the braking system that is got parts in it that you cannot get that easy, and so on and so on. It isn't even just the question of sensors that won't be available and electronics that won't be available, because they simply don't make them, they don't stock them anymore, and they're dedicated to that particular car. It'll be, as I say, simple things to do with engines, gearboxes. I mean, I had problems with a Citroen, for example, where the synchromesh had gone on to of the gears, and it was impossible to find the parts to repair the gearbox. So all of these things are going to happen. Now, at the moment, there are a lot of parts on some of these old cars that, even if they're not available, there are engineering companies still around that can remanufacture these parts. But even these are disappearing. We're going into an age that in this country and in the West, we just do not have the ability to make things anymore. And small parts that are needed to keep old cars going are not a priority in the great scheme of things. And of course, once values start to drop, which is what I think will happen, then another thing happens, is that they become more easily available to people. And these people are not necessarily people that will covet the cars and care for them, because that happens with most of the luxury cars. You know, when you can start buying a 15-year-old Jag for, you know, a few £1,000s, but you haven't got the money to maintain it, but you've got the money to buy it, drive it till it falls apart, basically, or it just stops working, and then you dump it. That's always been happening, and it's going to happen more, because once it reaches the time when suddenly something goes wrong and you can't either afford to repair it, or it's not possible to repair it, the car will just be basically scrapped or left in a condition that it will just deteriorate. I mean, that's not a new thing, but I think it's going to happen more and more. And it's hard to accept it, but a lot of the cars that we see on the road now that are the pride and joy of somebody will be on the back of a scrap collector's car, a truck or whatever, in a few years' time, I think. Because these cars, I mean, I've got cars myself, such as my Chrysler Crossfire, which I've now taken off the road. It's too expensive to keep paying the tax on it, which I don't use it enough. But the car isn't even worth selling, because the amount of money that I'll get for that car, I'd rather just keep the car. I love the car too much. It's just such a lovely car. And to just give it away for nothing to somebody who possibly may just do what I said, drive it until he can't keep it going anymore, I just don't want to do that. So, I think that's the end of this tirade, maybe you could call this, or rant, or whatever, I don't know. But I think classic cars, we've had a good time. I think it was a unique situation for the last couple of decades. And I think now it's a question of where we're going to end it, and how each of us as individuals are going to get out of it. But one thing's for certain in my mind, I'm going to enjoy the cars that I have, but I'm not going to spend, or invest, should I say, a lot of money into old cars now. I just don't see a future in cars at the level that I can afford now. And that is, it's not the level of cars where, you know, I can buy a car for 1.2 million or 800,000 or whatever. Those are not cars. They're places to put money on the basis that once you reach a certain level of value for an object, the value is based on the perceived or the perception of what people expect to pay and receive when they sell it, like paintings or works of art. But cars as a method or a means of transport, that's a different issue, which is what most cars are really, because that's what they are to most people. Okay, I don't know whether any of that has made any sense, and maybe most of you won't agree with me, but I've tried to just express how I feel about it. I think the next thing is that I'm on another video. I'm going to talk about the cars that I've owned and go through the cars that I've owned and what I thought about them. But if any of you have any ideas about where you think classics are going to be, or what I've said that's not right, let me know. I'm open to ideas. Okay, all the best. Thank you very much for watching.